we'll wait one more minute here as we're a couple minutes early. And just find out who else joins, and then we will kick off. But thanks so much for taking the time for joining us today. Okay, folks, let's get started. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. Thanks for taking the time out of your schedules. Thanks for joining us today at this Paladion webinar titled Third-Party Vendors, Trusted Partners, or a Game-Ending Security Threat. You all know that we are, as IT security professionals, quite diligent. We at Paladion have been involved in the security business since around 2000. We know we expend great significant resources, both human and financial, to harden our IT environments and to protect ourselves in real time, to identify and root out potential vulnerabilities before they can be exposed to any individuals who might be bent on gaining access to our critical data and harming our business operations. But more and more frequently, recently, I mean, the data breaches that are making the weekly headlines, more and more they seem to point the cause of a breach to an organization's third-party associates, the trusted partners that we rely on a day-to-day basis, really, to maintain the ongoing operations of our business. So how can we ensure that security vulnerabilities are not being introduced into our environment via this channel? That's our concern today. That's what we'll be talking about today. So what we'll do in the next, during this session, the next 20 or 30 minutes, is take a close look at how to put operations in place that will allow us to properly assess the security posture of our third-party partners and be able to assess how we can prevent vulnerabilities being created or exposed due to our interconnectivity with them. So today in our discussions, that's essentially the area that we'll be covering. We're privileged today to have with us an actual leader and innovator in this field, Rick D'Angona. Rick is an award-winning pioneer and innovator in the field. He's been a founding partner in 2 companies that provide vendor risk assessment. He's currently chairman and CEO at 3Pass Corp. And Rick holds a patent for the innovative way his company is assessing risk. Now, Rick and I have, we've talked about this. We've previewed our discussion today. We worked together on this, and so he's put some slides together that we'll be using. So as Rick and I are going back and forth in our discussion, I'll be picking and choosing from those slides and putting those up. Okay. Well, yeah, and before I bring Rick in, I just want to let you know that this is going to be a back and forth discussion, and you're all encouraged to enter questions as the webinar proceeds. You do have a text box available to you to enter any questions or comments as we go along, and we can take a look at that. So okay, Rick, thanks so much for joining the discussion today. I'll let you give you a second to introduce yourself, and then, but before that, and before we actually get started in the slides and going through all the detail and stuff, I recently read some information you had prepared talking about how we're tied to our vendors with sort of a ball and chain, and they in turn are tied to their vendors downstream, and their vendors are tied to their vendors. And, this all affects me as, a corporate provider of security, and this makes the whole problem of us assessing the impact our partners have on us, to be a difficult one. So I'll let you do the intro, and then could you just say an overview about that quickly, and then we'll go on with that.
If you do not have a PIN, just press pound or hash.
Go ahead, Rick.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for inviting me to the discussion. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Well, looks like somebody else is too. We have a little feedback on the line.
Yeah, it's always something. Go ahead.
As you know, I've spent the past 16 years or so working in various data security roles in some of the world's largest companies with global footprints. So I have a unique perspective, I think, on the role that procurement plays in the overall information security process. So what's great, I think, about today's conversation is we're going to try to highlight some of the ways procurement and information security work together currently, and maybe some improvements for the way they should work together in the future, specifically in the area of vendor risk management. So that's my goal today, and as you said in your opening remarks, I hope everyone is free to jump in with questions and really try to help us peel the onion on that topic. But I do want to address your question to me about the ball and chain. Excuse me. That metaphor kind of got me smiling because it gets everyone's attention. As we know, no one wants to have a ball and chain around their ankle, and the fact that we're equating the vendor ecosystem that a company uses to get their jobs done to a chain gang has been really getting a lot of attention. Because in reality, what we're trying to say with that image is that for better or worse, we're linked together. So just like in a chain gang, if one of the members of the chain gang falls down on the job, he could topple the entire chain gang, as in those 1930s movies, or even in that movie Cool Hand Luke, you get a view on how that all works. So in today's world, because most companies outsource a tremendous amount of the business processing and technical processing, we are relying on members of our ecosystem to do more and more work for us. And with that reliance comes a level of risk. And as we know as information security professionals, we don't really ever believe we're going to avoid risk entirely. Our job is really to manage it. So that's why we have that image of the ball and chain and the chain gang. Our hope is we can identify risk in our chain gang and try to mitigate it. But if that doesn't work, we're not going to be shy about swapping out a bad member of the chain gang for a better one who can swing a hammer a little bit better than the rest of them.
Okay. All right, so you're saying that, okay, so I'm worried about security in my own corporate environment. And then I've extended that, as our discussion says today, to, okay, what about my third-party vendors? What are they saying? So you're very clearly saying here, hey, it's even more difficult than that. You have to see beyond the folks that you're directly tied to and see who they're tied to downstream. Okay, that makes sense. So let's move forward then with that. Let's get into some details here. But my first thought, and when you and I first discussed this whole third-party assessment service, the question I had, and I think a lot of folks probably have, is, listen, do I really need to be concerned about this? Because, I mean, after all, let's say I'm consistently meeting my compliance regulations every year when I get audited. And I could be speaking about PCI or HIPAA or SOX or what have you, but, I'm feeling like I'm doing a pretty good job here. I'm secure, I'm meeting the compliance, and you're saying, now you're telling me I have to take additional steps in doing it. So, is this really my problem? And then let me add to that one more thing. When most of us sign a new vendor, they're going to sign something that says they understand their liability, they understand their responsibilities. So how concerned, is this a problem that I really have? How concerned should I be about this?
Well, I'm going to say yes, 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 yes to all those questions. The short answer here is yes, you need to be concerned about it. Because as the slide is showing you right now, this cartoon is showing you that we are in an ever-changing threat landscape, and we're also in an ever-changing risk and compliance regulatory environment. So what's interesting to me is that with the downturn in the economy, some of the cuts that were made in the area of security with information security teams and in particular chief information security officers and roles that would offer some governance and oversight. So it's, on one hand, it's an increasing threat, and on the other hand, there's less people watching. So yes, it is something that everyone should be concerned about. But let me attack a few of the questions that you asked me. I think the first question was, because a vendor has been certified as PCI or HIPAA compliant, why do we have to worry about that? And some people might even suggest that if a company has been PCI certified and listed on the website as PCI certified, that should be good enough for everyone. Well, let me just address that first. From my perspective, when a vendor comes into the mix and can represent that they've been PCI or HIPAA compliant, and therefore they have very little in the way of issues around security, you have to look at that as just one data point. Because even though a vendor, for example, can say they're PCI compliant, I've been involved in assessing companies for PCI compliance. I've also been the recipient of these documents when I've onboarded vendors. So I can tell you with authority that most often when a PCI certification or compliant statement is made, it's about a very specific portion of the technology that may or may not even support the work that you want them to do for you. And they may have weak controls in other areas. So the fact that they can attest that they've been provided with a certificate is fantastic, and I think that's something we need to give a company credit for. But I think we also need to have a critical eye at the other controls. I really believe that there's probably 10 to 12 domains under most internationally recognized security frameworks that highlight the controls that should be in place in a lot of areas in order to make you feel comfortable that your data is being handled correctly. So that's the idea about the compliant concept. I'm either compliant with PCI or with HIPAA or with other international regulations, so why would I need to worry? That's my response to that. Should I answer the other questions, or should I take a quick stop?
Well, no. Now that you mention it, no. Now that you mention it, Target was PCI compliant, right? So I guess what you said is exactly right. I met the audit, which says I met my compliance audit what's being demanded, but IT security is really a larger issue. It casts a broader net. So
yeah, it has a broader. And let's just speak about the Target issue just specifically. That's a perfect example because Target itself, the teams that support Target, the information security teams, and all the other internal processes going on at Target were reviewed and were PCI certified. And they're very pretty, for the most part, very robust controls were in place. It was that third party that they didn't even understand needed to be assessed that had the weak controls in place that were ultimately exploited by one of their third parties suppliers. So that's a perfect example of the public being lulled into this false sense of security. Because Target was assessed and granted a PCI certification and rubber stamped with, yes, they're fine, that doesn't necessarily extend out to their supply chain. And that's where the failure happened. And as we'll go through the slides, you'll see that it doesn't matter that Target wasn't really the company that fell down. It was, to the public, the vendor that caused the problem was still Target's problem. So at the end of the day, Target suffered.
Right. But so, well, that sort of gets into the second part of that question I ask you. I mean, when I bring a new vendor on, they usually do say that they're secure. Is it just that they don't understand the security issues, or is it this down chain effect that we're looking at that's causing the problems?
Well, if you flip one more slide, I think we can probably give an image for this. This is the problem right here, the cherry picking idea. The issue is, in most companies, when a vendor is onboarded, the first door they open is the door to procurement, after they've already negotiated the deal with the business sponsor that's sponsoring them into the company in the first place. So the procurement dilemma is they're the ones that are the traffic cop. They're the ones that are being told, okay, you have to triage all the vendors you're onboarding to determine if you think they should be reviewed by the information security team to see if there's controls that should be bolstered before we onboard them to the environment. But it's the procurement team that makes that choice. So if the procurement team doesn't flag a vendor to be reviewed by the information security team, guess what? The information security team isn't looking at that vendor, and it doesn't in most cases even know who that vendor is until something happens. Now, on the other side of the coin, when a procurement decision is made, they may inadvertently tag a vendor that needs to be reviewed in their minds. The information security team starts a review process only to discover that they really don't need to be reviewed because they're not really exchanging data, or they don't have connectivity to the system. So in essence, the procurement team has sent a vendor down the path that kind of wasted information security's time that could have been better spent on reviewing some of the vendors that fell through the cracks. So there's a whole problem in this area of cherry picking, and this is where the problem starts from my perspective and all the years I've spent in the business.
Yeah, I can see what you're saying, because procurement really, for them to do their job properly, would really have to be IT security experts, and we all know the reality there. Okay, but wait a minute. Now let's talk reality here. So you're saying cherry picking is a bad habit, but let's say I've got a few hundred vendors, or a few thousand, which is probably not atypical at all. How do I know which? I don't understand. You're telling me I was going to ask you, how do I know which one of those I should be checking and assessing? I was going to say I can't check all of them, right? But you're essentially saying I do have to check all of them. How that? That seems like a costly, time-consuming type thing to do, and I don't know that I've got the horsepower to do that right now.
You probably don't. To be quite honest and quite blunt, most companies, think about this. We just worked with a company that one of the most well-known technology companies in the world with a global footprint that's incredible. They've been in business since 1986. They have roughly 30 years of vendor relationships on their procurement systems. Many of the vendors they onboarded in the late 80s and the early 90s are still supporting them. But think about that. They've had these vendors on their systems for almost 30 years. Some of these vendors, when they were onboarded, there was never even a hint that information security would be at risk of failure, that there would be exposure, because when they were onboarded, there wasn't even really an internet being used for commerce and that kind of thing. Not to mention the regulatory changes that have happened over the past 10, 12, 15 years. So think about it. A procurement officer or the head of procurement is sitting on a powder keg. They have 20 years, 15 years, 10 years, 3 years worth of vendors that are in their system that have never really properly been vetted, only because they didn't have a screening process to vet them at the time, because when they were onboarded, there weren't the concerns that we have today. So your question is, we're having, how do you do this? Because you don't really have the manpower or the skill set to go backward to look at all the vendors that you currently even have on your system, never mind looking forward for the new vendors as they onboard every day, because your folks on your team aren't information security experts. They really don't know. Often they go by the name of the company or the reputation of the company or things they heard from the business unit. So they make these kind of random decisions, and they randomly cherry pick the ones to send down the line to information security. So from my perspective, the first thing a procurement officer should do is to identify the list of all the active vendors that are currently on the system. And believe it or not, most companies today have more than one procurement system, and often the procurement officers don't even have a comprehensive list of all the vendors that are in an environment. So it starts with that. There isn't even a consolidated list of active vendors currently supporting the company. So that has to be done, I think, first. You have to get a handle on who your vendors are. Then I think once you have that handle, you can start to triage the list using an objective criteria. And it could be a very simple objective criteria. Ask the vendor, do you exchange data with us electronically? Do you have connectivity to our systems? 2 questions. It might be as simple as that. If they get positive responses on those questions, then they're put in a bucket for review. If they respond in a way that would be no or with conditions, maybe they don't qualify for a risk assessment and they're discarded from the list.
Yeah, but Rick, I mean, you know, you're talking about a lot of these vendors, as you said before, you know, I may not have contacted in years. You know, I mean, some of these vendors, we don't, you know, if it isn't broken, we don't fix it, right? So things are going along smoothly. So I don't even, you know, I don't even know how I'd go about. I mean, I've got a lot of vendors. You asking me, I'm going to have to call each one, reestablish contact, find out who their vendors are. Is this, I mean, this is an awful lot of work. It sounds like you're putting on my table here.
I am, but let me tell you why. Don't you think it's, you know, just listen to the question you asked me. As the procurement officers are, you know, playing that role, asking me that question. Mm-hmm. Don't you think it's risky that the head of procurement doesn't know who the active vendors are or who the point of contact would be at those vendors? That in and of itself is a huge risk. Mm-hmm. Because if the procurement lead doesn't understand who the vendors are or what they do, then how would we expect the information security team to figure it out?
Right. Right. But will, I mean, do you have a solution that will help me, like identify all these vendors and get the information about them?
Yeah, we do, and I can go over that at the end of the presentation, but you don't even, you know, in some cases if a company is reluctant to engage a company like our company, 3Pass, they can do some of this work themselves. It will take them a lot of time. But the fact of the matter is it starts with gathering the information, and it might take them a while, to your point. But once they get the list of active vendors, then they have to interview the vendor, whether it's through email, on the phone. They have to figure out what services are being provided. And then somebody has to make a decision, like I suggested very simply, do you exchange data or do you have connectivity? And then start the ball rolling to get a handle on it. Because as you mentioned, Target, I mean, everyone knows at this point that the vendor that affected that disastrous breach was an HVAC vendor, and there isn't an information security person on the planet that would have gone through a list of vendors and picked out an HVAC vendor as somebody they should do a data security review on.
Right. Right.
But if a procurement officer asks the question, simply put, do you exchange data or do you have connectivity to our system, that HVAC vendor that breached or caused that breach to Target would have had to have answered yes, because that's what caused the problem. They had wireless connectivity to the financial systems.
Mm-hmm. Yep. No, that's
anyway,
right.
Not to get on my
no,
passion
that,
fleet, but that's how it goes.
No, that's good. And I know you and I have talked a lot before, but I'm actually learning a lot in this presentation, so that's good. So, so it sounds like a lot of the work that I'm concerned with doing, like having to go through all this vendor information myself, actually sending them the email, sounds like you're taking that off my plate and doing that for me, which is all well and good. But it sounds like an awful lot of work that you're doing on your part. So let's talk about what everybody who's listening right now is thinking. Okay, sounds like a good solution, but do I have the money to afford this solution? Can you tell me something about how I pay for this?
Yes, I absolutely can. I mean, at 3Pass, our whole value proposition is we really believe that vendors should be assessed for risk annually, and it should be a cost of doing business. Just like it is when a vendor has to get insurance or produce a criminal background check or produce HR documents that they are entitled to work within the United States and those kinds of documents. So our whole belief here is we really should have a process much like a credit bureau where a company who wants to engage with a supplier can pull a risk report on that supplier and assess for themselves, is the risk that vendor has inherent in their environment going to be within my risk tolerance range? And if it's not, what can we do about it? So our whole goal here is to get a risk bureau created where people can come and go and grab those reports if they need them, and if they don't find the report, they can request a report, and we can turn it around pretty quickly. But the key here is the vendor being assessed pays the fee to our company to do the assessment. And it's a very inexpensive proposition for the vendor. We've greatly reduced the fee structure for an assessment because we have the patent in place. We have all of the patented algorithms that run through the process like a credit bureau does to get a credit report. And we have teams of risk analysts that are skilled and adept at providing a service to our customers to get the ball rolling. So we reduce the fee, but we also have a guarantee that people always raise an eyebrow about, which is we can go through to that procurement officer, and we can say to that procurement officer, Mr. Procurement Officer, you've been onboarding vendors since 1985. You have, in the case of one of our entertainment customers, they have, believe it or not, 136,000 suppliers on their system. But those suppliers are a whole host of services being provided, like cameramen and makeup artists and carpenters and all of that. But they also have lots of vendors that handle data and all of the intellectual property that goes into making a motion picture that they need assessed. So we would say to that entertainment giant, look, give us those 135,000 suppliers. We will validate the active suppliers, and we will triage your list for you using a simple set of triage questions. Just like we stated, do you exchange data with us? Do you have connectivity to our systems? And maybe 2 or 3 other questions that the customer wants us to throw in. Based on the responses to those screening questions, we would divide their whole 135,000, 36,000 vendors into 2 buckets. The ones that need risk assessments by the information security team and the ones that do not. And our experience has been over the past 9 years that about 10% of a supply chain really needs a risk assessment. The other 90% really does not. There's other things that have to be reviewed for those folks, which I won't go into right now. But for the 10% that need a review, it has to be done, in our opinion, with an internationally recognized framework like ISO. The vendor has to complete the assessment. We believe the vendor's assessment needs to be scored, and then it has to be shared. And the reason we're big proponents about scoring the assessment is because it's one thing for an information security team to put out a spreadsheet like the shared assessments program has, or ISO spreadsheets, or whatever the spreadsheet may be, to gather the information from a vendor. But what happens often is the vendor returns the information in the spreadsheet, and all that does is add more work to the information security team, because they have to do a subjective review of the answers that are provided. So it adds a lot of work to their queue. So if you can imagine an information security team that's already stressed, trying to keep their own controls strong and their own environment safe, suddenly getting deluged with hundreds, if not thousands, of spreadsheets with all of the responses from all of these vendors. That doesn't work. So what we've done is we've scored these responses so they get a scored report, and they can develop their own risk tolerance range. So they can say, if the score goes between this value and this value, I want to look at that. If it's not in that value range, let's set it aside for this time frame, and maybe we'll go back to it when we have some free time. But let's concentrate on this particular risk tolerance range. And that's how we help the information security team plow through all of this and turn it around in a way that makes sense to procurement. Because remember, it's one thing to do a catch-up to get the baseline fixed, the 135,000 of these suppliers that need to be triaged. But once that's finished, on an ongoing basis, today and tomorrow, the procurement team is still onboarding vendors, and they're still asking information security to jump in and give them a quick read on how well these vendors are securing data. But it's often not fair to the information security team, because they usually only have 4 or 5 days to respond, because they don't want to kill the deal with the vendor. And the business owner and the procurement team are hounding the information security team. Let's get this done. Let's do this quickly. What are you holding this up for? Drop what you're doing. Get this finished. You're killing the deal. And it gets worse and worse for the info security teams the closer it comes to the end of their budget year, because all of us on the phone have been in the position where there's money to spend before the budget expires at the end of the year. So often a senior member of the company will say, you can spend the money in your budget, go and get services that you didn't get that you could really use. Just spend the money. So at the end of these cycles, you see the procurement people being bombarded with new deals and new vendors constantly, and the info security people team can't keep up trying to get the assessments done. So we try to alleviate all of that with these scored reports.
Right, right. So I think that was an important list you just ran down. I mean, even for those of us who don't have 130,000 suppliers, which hopefully most of us don't, but we still have more than we want to manage on a day-to-day basis. But what you're saying is, listen, we've got standard procedures, operating procedures, tried and true, that start with parsing the supply chain from, whatever the number is, down to maybe 10% that really need a true risk assessment. And then we've got standard operating procedures that use international frameworks to conduct an assessment, and then from that assessment, that key phase of scoring, so that someone can look at the results of the assessment and make an evaluation without having to go through all of the details of the assessment and try to interpret themselves. And then we've got a tried and true process for sharing as well. So it's that standard operating procedures that work for parsing, for assessing, for scoring, and for sharing that get to the highlight of what we're offering here, I think.
Yep, well stated. I mean, what we tried to do with FreePass is we tried to alleviate the burden from both the procurement team for making the decision in the first place, who to assess and who not to assess. So we hope to have really helped them out, and we also really believe we've helped out the information security team, because we're not just sending them a name of a company and a vendor point of contact. We're sending them a report and all the evidence and documentation that supports the assessment that was conducted. So they basically go from gathering data in a short window of time to reviewing the data that was gathered and making strategic decisions that support the company's overview and mission. So that's how we hope to help both sides of that equation.
Right, right, good. Okay, so I did have a summary slide here. I don't know if this, since we had a freewheeling discussion, it summarizes more or less what we were talking about, but essentially it seems like, you know, the primary benefit here is that we're talking about a solution that would allow me, you know, to get a clean look at, you know, who we're working with and whether they are a danger to us from a security perspective. A solution that addresses the risk we face every day as we, you know, necessarily interact with our third-party vendors. And it's really pretty straightforward, and it's not costly because the costs of the solution are spread across the partners that are actually, you know, that actually stand to benefit by the review and that actually could be creating potential risk. You know, they in turn are getting value because they're going to get credentials that they can share with other partners that they may have now or they may have in the future, which gives them a stamp of approval from a security perspective. So this all gives me a, you know, a bit of a peace of mind, since the work we're doing validates all of the other security work which is taking place in the network, which is taking place in the whole IT environment, you know, be it for specific compliance or corporate regulations that we need to meet. So this certainly sits right on top of that, and this sounds like a win-win for both the corporate network side, for the procurement group, and for the partners that we're interacting with. Yeah, I think that, I mean, that's why, you know, we as Paladion have been, as I said, we've been in the IT security business since about 2000. And this recently, a lot of our, you know, customers have come to us and said, this is great, but now I'm concerned about, you know, third parties and the exposure there. They're reading the same news, the news announcements that we are reading every week. So that's why we brought this solution, this third-party assessment solution, into our suite of security products to round things out. Okay, I will give Rick a last word here, but like I just like to say to everyone, remember that, you know, please submit any questions right now. We're gonna take a few of your questions before we get off here, if you'll stick around and listen for a while. So we'll wait a couple of minutes to see if some questions moved in. I put our contact information up on the screen here. Everyone who attends the webinar today, we will be sending out a white paper that Rick has recently written. But there's the contact information to get further information, to find out some of the special offers we have associated with third-party assessment services right now. Okay, so let me see if we got any questions coming in here.
Can I just add one thing?
Please,
while we're
please.
reading questions?
Please.
I think it's very important to make this point, that right now we're speaking as though the enterprise group is dealing with all of their vendors and getting that all under control so they understand their ecosystem. But it's important to remember that the enterprise is also a vendor to somebody else. So what our solution offers, really, if you think about it, is a LinkedIn kind of a view into data security risk, because we start with one enterprise who then does their vendor chain, direct tier 1 type vendors, and those tier 1 type vendors for the small affordable fee to get an assessment on their own systems also are allowed to have their supply chains assessed at no fee, other than the fee they had to pay in order to satisfy the original enterprise. So it's very cost effective, but it allows the enterprise, when they become a vendor, to tell the customer they're supporting that they are not only compliant within their own environment, but they understand the risks posed to them by their own supply chain ecosystem. So I just wanted to make that point. We all we're vendors and we're customers.
Right. No, that is a very good point. We've sort of been looking down the chain, but this solution all gives us the ability to look up the chain as well. So that's right. We fit both things. Okay, Rick, I got a couple questions here I'll pass on to you. The first one is, Do we see this to be industry specific? Oh, people are asking about verticals here. Like, is this something that really fits healthcare more than it fits retail, they're asking. Could you just speak? I mean, I think you've probably got customers across all verticals. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I don't know who asked it. I asked my mother to come online and ask a couple good questions, so maybe that's her. But thanks, Mom. No, what's great about that is look at Target, look at Home Depot. They're retail. Our system actually is in place today in one of the world's largest financial services company. We have one of the largest technology companies. We have an entertainment vertical. We have drugs and medical facilities. And it really doesn't matter the vertical, because as you think about it, every company has a supplier that provides them services, whether they're data related or not. So our vertical penetration has been very broad, as a short answer for that. But think right. Target, think Home Depot, think Goodwill, the charitable retail outlet. They were breached recently too. So retail is a prime target for us.
Right. Okay, that's good. And then this other question sort of is in a similar line. Someone's saying, I've only got about 100 to 130 vendors right now. I'm thinking I can manage these myself. Should I wait until there's, I think it's saying higher number? I think, so someone's saying they think they've got a small situation now. Is our solution really just for high-end, for, large corporations?
No. Actually, most of our small to mid-sized companies have less than 100. But I used the entertainment company example because we were talking about procurement at that point and how procurement's overwhelmed with thousands of vendors and they have no idea who they are or what they provide. So that's really the context for that large number of vendors. In reality, most companies have under 100 vendors, and that's a perfect size for us too, because for us to do the assessment, all we really need from a company is the name of their service provider and the vendor contact information. And then we will tee it up and we will help them figure out if that vendor needs to be assessed from a risk perspective or let off the hook. So any number of vendors, we processed as few as, I think, probably like in the 70s, like 71 or 2 vendors for a smaller company.
Okay. No, that's good. That gives people a good idea, I think. All right.
Yeah, it's a great question.
All right. And I think that's all the questions we got right now, so that probably wraps us up. I'd like to, Rick and I are more than glad to get on the phone one-to-one with any of you. We do a one-on-one WebEx. We went into, the process itself has a lot of steps to it. We mentioned a lot of things that we didn't actually show you slides on today, but we do have deep dive WebEx presentations we give, one-on-one with companies. So please feel free to use the contact numbers on the screen, reach out to us, and we'd be glad to go into all the depth and more than you'd want to hear about our third-party assessment service as we go forward.
And please link in with, if you're not linked in to Tom on LinkedIn or me, please feel free to do that, and we'll be very happy to keep you informed as to when we have things for you to see and share with you.
Good point. Okay, so thank you, everyone. We look forward. Thank you, Rick, for joining us today, and we all look forward to hopefully continuing this conversation as we go along. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.